New information has come out about Jeffrey Epstein and his death, and it is incredibly important, and yet you're seeing zero coverage by your mainstream media. Of course, I mean, they're garbage, so why would they? Why would they care? This article is by Kit Klarenberg, who was just banned by Twitter. It says the internal prison files suggest a Epstein suicide cover-up. And I know many of you are going, well, duh, but these are new documents that have only just been these documents have just been got by Kit Klarenberg. He filed a Freedom of Information Act. Internal U.S. Bureau of Prisons, the BOP, Bureau of Prisons documents obtained by the gray zone under Freedom of Information laws raise extremely serious questions about whether Jeffrey Epstein's alleged first suicide attempt, which I hadn't even followed, but apparently there was a so-called first suicide attempt in July 23rd, 2019, whether it in fact happened. And it suggests the Bureau distorted evidence to attribute his death to suicide, his later actual death, to suicide before his autopsy had even been completed. This meant the narrative of suicide was pushed on the public to the exclusion of all other explanations before basic facts were ascertained. Epstein was found to have died in his cell at New York City's Metropolitan Correctional Center on August 10, 2019, with a medical examiner ruling at the time that he had taken his own life by hanging. And I've covered all this in the past, this part of it, but as you'll see, there's new documents. Epstein's legal team publicly declared available evidence on his death was far more consistent with murder. And one of the most important things was that the doctor, the forensic pathologist who monitored the autopsy, claimed that the findings did not support suicide. Moreover, knowledgeable sources revealed the broken bones in Epstein's neck rarely ever break during hanging. They usually only break during strangulation. And the other thing, which I have reported on, which I haven't heard many people mention this, is that I imagine that in the small percentage of times where those bones break during hanging, it's a violent hanging, like someone jumping off jumping out a window and hanging themselves, or jumping off a higher surface and hanging themselves. And that's when those bones break. This was obviously not one of those, because this is in a tiny prison cell. The only way you hang yourself is by leaning forward, calmly against something and choking yourself to death. It's not the violent type of hanging that you might think of in the Old West, where they open the platform. Anyway, the official inquiry by the Department of Justice Inspector General states that in July 23rd, 2019, nearly 3 weeks before his death, Epstein was found injured and semi-conscious in his cell with marks of an unspecified nature around his neck. Per the report, he subsequently claimed to know nothing about the incident, which took place just 2.5 weeks following his imprisonment on charges of child sex trafficking. Epstein's cellmate, former New York police officer Nicholas Tartaglione, also pleaded ignorance. So there's a report that he attempted suicide, yet there's essentially no evidence to back that up, that he attempted it before he supposedly suicided himself. The records show that the following day of this attempt, Epstein was removed from suicide watch and charged with violating Prison Code 228, which covers tattooing or self-mutilation. So he's charged with self-mutilation, removed from suicide watch after supposedly attempting suicide. It all makes no sense if it were legit. I mean, it makes perfect sense if you're people trying to cover up the fact that someone was murdered and you want to make it look like he had attempted suicide before. Curiously, on July 30th, the official incident report was updated to include self-mutilation as the cause of Epstein's failed suicide, citing indeterminate lacerations. However, an examination by prison doctors just hours after he allegedly tried to take his life mentioned 0 lacerations. And yet he's violated the prison code for self-mutilation. A memo issued after the incident eerily notes that Epstein's so-called self-mutilation was expunged from the official records. Just 5 days after Epstein's death, the Board of Prisons representative remarked it was unclear why it had been expunged and whether Mr. Epstein knew this. Mainstream media has not acknowledged this peculiar episode since the memo appeared. It has also ignored the critical question of whether the alleged incident ever took place at all, or whether it was fabricated to bolster the case for suicide. So like I said, this makes no sense if it's real. He attempts suicide, self-mutilation, but there's actually no mutilation that the doctors can find. He's then taken off suicide watch after he's attempted suicide, if it ever took place at all. One evaluation noted that he explicitly denied suicidal ideation, planning, and intent, and was committed to life and safety. So obviously in prisons, they're constantly trying to decide, not constantly, in some cases, they're trying to decide whether you're a suicide risk. In Epstein's case, the interviews showed no intent of committing suicide. The doctors describe him as thinking he's going to beat these charges and get out of prison, that he wouldn't be there for long. He also denied fearing for his safety and outlines plans to finish this case and go back to his normal life. And furthermore, and this is interesting, as a practicing Jew, which he was a rather religious Jew and also had plenty of connections to Mossad. As a practicing Jew, he abhorred suicide because suicide is against the Jewish religion. The report noted, given that and it's also, if you're a really kind of more Orthodox Jew, it's also you're not allowed to tattoo yourself or use other type of, self-mutilation or whatever. Given that the overall acute suicide risk for this inmate was quote unquote low, and the overall chronic suicide risk for this inmate was absent entirely, the Board of Prisons concluded suicide watch is not warranted at this time. They're claiming it's not warranted, yet he had just tried to commit suicide apparently, and then they later put him back on suicide watch, that's where he is when he's suicided or murdered. None of it adds up unless this is a group of varying people trying to set up a murder, but some of them don't know it. So you have doctors coming in and going, there's no proof of mutilation. You have others then putting in paperwork saying, oh no, there was mutilation. Despite Epstein's apparent aversion to taking his own life, he was placed on suicide watch. Oddly, this decision was rescinded on July 24th, 2019, the day after he allegedly attempted suicide. 6 days later, he gained a new cellmate, is removed, leaving Epstein alone. And that cellmate winds up dead not long after. Regular checks on the inmate also ceased. 3 CCTV cameras nearby apparently malfunctioned. 2 on-duty guards fabricated records to hide how they allegedly flouted their legal duties to surf the internet. And the next day, the prison's most famous inmate was dead. That's another good point, is that this is their most famous inmate. So wouldn't you watch this way more than any other inmate? Like, wow, we're going to keep track of this guy. Like, he is our most famous inmate. If something happened to him, it is going to look so awful for the Board of Prisons, for Manhattan Prison, for all, it is like they would be on him like a hawk. Instead, you have all the cameras going off. You have them falling asleep, everything else. The pair of guards were subsequently charged with falsifying prison records, a serious criminal offense. However, on December 13, 2021, the charges were dropped and they walked free. The public did not learn of this until December 31st, 2 days after Ghislaine Maxwell was found guilty of trafficking young girls for sexual abuse on Epstein's behalf. The immediate wake of Epstein's death, the Board of Prisons immediately assured journalists and members of the Epstein family that he had committed suicide. The resultant report recorded that the video of the significant incident was confiscated by the FBI before it could be reviewed, and no one's ever seen it, apparently. The psychological report said, when he was still alive, said he is not the type who likes pain or would ever attempt to harm himself. He even does not like when he has to give blood. The Times did not acknowledge that the psychological reconstruction indicated that financial transactions associated with Epstein's prison stay revealed one of his attorneys was depositing funds into the prison account of cellmate Efrain Reyes for unknown reasons. It is no wonder then that he became a person of interest in the FBI's investigation of Epstein's death. In return for his help, he was moved to a minimum security prison, which housed high-value cooperating witnesses. 5 months after his release from prison, due to the COVID-19 outbreak, Reyes died, purportedly of complications from COVID-19. In January 2021, the federal prosecutors rejected journalists' request for full disclosure of the death of Reyes, ruling that all records it held on Epstein's former cellmate would remain sealed. In dismissing the media's transparency demands, authorities provided 2 pages of information about Epstein and the files related to Reyes. However, all were redacted. So there you go, folks. Just a little something more on what's being covered up about Epstein. And the new stuff from this report by Kit Klarenberg, who's just been banned by Twitter, the new information is that is mainly about Epstein's first suicide attempt, which came several days before his death. And that first attempt is very confused in the paperwork. Apparently, they took him off a suicide watch after he attempted suicide. He was quoted by doctors as not seeming like someone who would commit suicide, and yet he had attempted suicide. He supposedly committed self-mutilation, and yet no lacerations were seen by the doctors. All very confused, yet all kind of points to someone trying to leave enough evidence that this is a guy who would kill himself, even if it was not.